Imagine walking alone through the desert, the scorching sun above your head, the sand burning your feet, and a thirst that seems to consume your soul. Now imagine being just a child in this situation, accompanied only by your desperate mother, both expelled from home and seemingly abandoned by God. This is the story of Ishmael, Abraham's first son, a story that many know superficially, but few truly understand in its depth and meaning. Welcome to the Sacred Scriptures channel. Today, we'll dive into a narrative that goes far beyond what you've already heard about Abraham's family. A story of divine promises, human rejection, and celestial redemption that will touch your heart and transform your perspective on God's unconditional love. Have you ever wondered why some biblical stories seem to stay in the shadows while others get all the spotlight? Why is Ishmael, Abraham's firstborn, often left aside when we talk about the patriarch of faith? And more importantly, what can this young man's story teach us about God's faithfulness, even when all seems lost? Prepare yourself for a journey through time and desert, where we'll discover that apparent abandonment can be the perfect stage for the most extraordinary manifestations of divine love. And before we continue, I'd like to invite you to reflect. How many times have you felt like Ishmael, apparently forgotten, relegated to a secondary role in your own story? Share your experience in the comments, because your perspective might be exactly what someone needs to hear today. Let's explore together how God works behind the scenes of our lives, even when we think we're alone in the desert of our circumstances. The story we're going to share today begins with a promise. Not the famous promise made to Abraham about Isaac, but an earlier promise, equally powerful and significant, that would forever change the course of human history. A promise that teaches us about the greatness of God's heart, which knows no favoritism, but loves each of his children with a unique and special love. Think for a moment, how many times do we wrongly judge that God has favorites? That some people are more blessed or more loved than others? Ishmael's story will profoundly challenge this limited perspective and show us a God much greater than our human preconceptions can imagine. To truly understand the magnitude of this story, we need to go back to the context where it all began. Abraham and Sarah, still known as Abram and Sarai, faced the painful reality of infertility. In a culture where descendants were considered the greatest divine blessing, the absence of children was more than personal sadness. It was seen as a sign of divine disfavor. It was in this scenario of desperation and impatience that Sarah made a decision that would forever change the course of their lives, offering her Egyptian servant Hagar as a concubine to Abraham. This practice, although strange to our modern eyes, was common in antiquity and considered legally acceptable. But what started as a human solution to a divine plan turned into a complex web of emotions, conflicts, and consequences that reverberate to this day. Have you ever stopped to think about how our attempts to help God fulfill his promises can complicate things even more? How our impatience can generate situations that affect not only our lives, but also the lives of future generations? Ishmael's conception wasn't a divine error, but a divine permission that teaches us profound lessons about trusting in God's timing. When Hagar became pregnant, the family dynamics changed drastically. The servant, now carrying the patriarch's child, began to despise her mistress, and Sarah in turn responded with harshness and oppression. This cycle of resentment and retaliation shows us how human relationships can deteriorate when we allow pride and bitterness to contaminate our hearts. But even amid this whirlwind of human emotions, God wasn't absent. He saw Hagar's suffering when she fled to the desert, pregnant and desperate. It was there, by a water spring, that the angel of the Lord found her and made an extraordinary promise about her unborn son. What special promise would that be? How did God demonstrate his care for one whom the world considered merely a disposable servant? Ishmael's birth was a moment of great joy for Abraham. For 13 years, this boy was the patriarch's only son, the apparent heir to all divine promises. Abraham deeply loved his firstborn, and we can imagine the precious moments that father and son shared during these years. The scriptures show us that Abraham's love for Ishmael was so great that even after Isaac's birth his heart was divided. When Sarah demanded that Hagar and Ishmael be expelled, the biblical text tells us that this matter greatly distressed Abraham. Can you imagine this father's pain, forced to choose between his children? How would you react if you were in Abraham's place, having to send your beloved son to an uncertain future in the desert? This part of the narrative confronts us with profound questions about obedience, trust, and the price of divine calling. But it's also here that we see God's faithfulness manifest in an extraordinary way. When Hagar and Ishmael were expelled, taking only a skin of water and some bread, it seemed all hope was lost. The desert stretched before them like a vast sea of sand and death. When the water ran out and Ishmael was about to succumb to thirst, Hagar placed him under a bush and walked away, for she couldn't bear to see her son die. It's in this moment of extreme despair that God again intervenes, revealing a spring of water and reaffirming his promise about Ishmael's future. What a powerful lesson about how God acts precisely in the moments when we think we're completely abandoned. Have you ever experienced a situation where everything seemed lost, but God surprisingly opened a way? The story continues to unfold extraordinarily in the desert of Paran, where Ishmael grew up under divine protection. The scriptures tell us that God was with the boy, a simple but deeply significant phrase. While the world may have seen Ishmael as the rejected son, God saw him as the object of his special love and care. Now let's explore a fascinating aspect of this story that is rarely discussed: Ishmael's spiritual legacy. Many don't know, but the scriptures reveal that Ishmael not only survived in the desert, but became the father of a mighty nation, exactly as God had promised. His 12 sons became princes, each leading their own tribe, settling from Havilah to Shur, which is opposite Egypt in the direction of Assyria. This territorial expansion wasn't coincidence, but the literal fulfillment of the promise God made to Hagar years before, when she was pregnant and first fled. Have you ever stopped to think about how meticulous God is in fulfilling his promises? How each prophesied detail is fulfilled with extraordinary precision? Ishmael's story teaches us that when God makes a promise, he fulfills it not only in essence, but in every minute detail. This leads us to a profound reflection about our own faith journey. How many times do we fail to notice the fulfillment of God's promises in our life simply because we're looking in the wrong places or in the wrong way? Ishmael's legacy wasn't limited to just his physical descendants. His story became a living testimony of God's faithfulness, inspiring generations to trust in the Lord, even when circumstances seem adverse. Think about it. A young man expelled from home with his mother, apparently condemned to die in the desert, becomes the patriarch of a numerous and prosperous nation. What a powerful message about how God can transform our greatest tragedies into extraordinary triumphs. What situation in your life seems impossible today? What desert are you crossing? Remember, the same God who saw Ishmael in the desert is seeing you now. A particularly touching aspect of Ishmael's story is how God revealed himself to him and his mother in the most critical moments. The scriptures record not one, but 2 dramatic divine interventions in their lives. First, when Hagar was pregnant and fled, and then when they were expelled and were about to die in the desert. On both occasions, God manifested through an angel, providing not only immediate physical help, but also words of hope and promises for the future. This pattern reveals something profound about God's character. He not only rescues us from crises, but uses these moments to establish relationship with us and reveal his greater purposes. Have you ever experienced such a moment in your life? A moment when God not only solved your problem, but used that situation to reveal something greater about his plans. The way God treated Ishmael and Hagar also teaches us about the dignity he confers on the marginalized and those considered less important by society. In an era when slaves and their children were seen as disposable property, God demonstrated personal and loving care for them, elevating them to the position of protagonists in a redemption story. This truth remains relevant today, in a world that often determines people's value based on their social position, achievements, or appearance. God continues to see each individual as precious and worthy of his special love and attention. The last recorded encounter between Ishmael and his family occurred at Abraham's funeral, where he and Isaac came together to bury their father. This touching moment shows us that, despite all the circumstances that separated them, the family bond remained. More importantly, it shows us how God is able to bring healing and reconciliation even in the most unlikely situations. Ishmael's story isn't just a historical narrative. It's a living testimony of God's unconditional love and how he fulfills his promises, even when the world seems to have forgotten us. It's a story that teaches us about grace, redemption, and the meticulous care of a God who sees beyond external circumstances and human judgments. What lessons can we take today from this ancient story? How can we apply these truths in our own lives? First, we learn that there are no forgotten children in God's kingdom. Each of us has a special place in the Father's heart, regardless of how the world sees or judges us. Second, we discover that the deserts in our lives can be places of encounter with God and fulfillment of promises. And finally, we are reminded that God is faithful to fulfill his promises, even when the path seems impossible. Finally, we need to consider the historical and prophetic impact of the fulfillment of the promises made to Ishmael. The scriptures tell us that he lived 137 years, a long and blessed life, witnessing the fulfillment of everything God had promised. His descendants not only survived, but prospered, forming nations that played significant roles in world history. This literal fulfillment of divine promises serves as a powerful testimony of God's faithfulness through generations. When we look at our own generation, what promises of God seem impossible to fulfill? What situations in our life or in our society seem as desperate as the desert that Ishmael faced? His story reminds us that God is an expert in making the impossible happen, in transforming deserts into oases, in bringing life where there seemed to be only death. More than that, his story teaches us that there are no secondary characters in God's kingdom. Each person, each story, each journey has a special purpose in the great divine plan. Before we close, I'd like to ask you one last question for reflection. How has Ishmael's story changed your perspective about the desert moments in your life? Share in the comments your experience and how this message touched your heart. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and turn on the notification bell to continue receiving content that builds your faith and expands your understanding of the scriptures. Until the next video, and remember, just as God never forgot Ishmael, he will never forget you.